I would like to issue a disclaimer before we start discussing this question. I would not have been able to solve it, and I'm going to take a step further and say that most people would not be able to solve it. So, with that done, I can, however, try and explain what the logic behind the answer is, but then we have to understand that this is in hindsight once you know the answer, because this question seems to break most of the usual rules that we follow. Now, we're still going to apply the sort-link sequence, but I will show you how far I was able to get before I gave up. Now, let's look at the first sentence. When you say it can in fact be integrated, this particular phrase, in fact, tells us that this is going to be a follower, because here I am emphasizing a point that I have already made. So, the previous point needs to be very similar to this, but at least I know that one is a follower. The second one also looks like a follower, except that because I have been reading a lot of text, I realize that some articles may start off with a very generic introduction. So, when I say it's a case of it's easy once you've thought of it in the political sphere, after this I may present the case or the topic that I actually want to talk about. So, there's this sense that this could be the starter. There's one more reason that that sense prevails. It's because I could not fit two anywhere in the sequence. I mean, it looks like a follower, but I don't really know where it can be fit after which sentence. So, that tells me it is either the starting sentence or the concluding sentence, but definitely not going to be in the middle. That is why I'm saying may be the starter. The third one, this is probably the starter that most of you picked. And if I were to follow the rules for Parajumbles, I would say, yeah, 3 looks like it is introducing the panoptic mechanism. In fact, this is the only sentence that tells us what we are talking about. So yes, 3 looks like a starter. So let's say that. Now, the fourth statement says, in short. This clearly is summarizing a point that has already been made. So this is definitely a follower. Now, this is as far as I was able to get. I did try a few mandatory pairs, but that proved to be wrong. So, I'm not going to tell you how my thought process was. Let's now take a look at what the answer is and why it is the answer. Again, all of this is hindsight, it's reverse engineering. So, we already know that 2 and 3 can be starters. What we have to understand is that when I say it's a case of it's easy once you've thought of it in the political sphere, we are trying to say that something is a very smart political maneuver. That is what 2 is saying. It assumes that the topic is already known. So, this text obviously has been taken from the middle somewhere. It is not from the beginning of the article or the book. So, topic is already known and we are saying, it's a very clever way of doing things. After that, we are probably going to say why it is a clever way. So, when we say it's easy once you've thought of it, it means that it's probably easy to apply or it's very easy to do. So, the sentence that explains how it is easy to apply or easy to do is the first one. It can in fact be integrated into any function. That is why it's very clever, because we can integrate it into any function. So, that is how 2 and 1 are supposed to be paired off. Now, let's look at the rest. After 1, we have said that it can be integrated into any function. Relations of power may be precisely adjusted. So, we have already explained how the mechanism works. The fourth statement is simply summarizing how the mechanism works. That's it. So, 4 is a summary of ideas in 1 because it says in short. And then if we look at 3 seems to be a very general comment on the significance of the panoptic mechanism. So, I know that 3 for most of us is going to be the starter, but actually here it's the concluding statement because it seems to be an evaluative comment. Before this, we are explaining how the mechanism is clever, how it functions, and now we are saying that it's not just a hinge, it is a way of making power relations function in a function. So, we are highlighting how it is a very important thing. And that is why the answer is supposed to be 2, 1, 4, 3. Now, I know that I haven't done a great job of explaining to you how to solve it, but honestly, I feel that this question is difficult or rather impossible to solve. And therefore, in the exam, I would have probably guessed at the answer and left it at that. I would say this is a moderately difficult passage. There are pros and cons to it. Let's first start with the pros. Once you understand the main idea, all the questions are easy to answer. If you don't grasp that basic idea, however, it's going to be a little difficult. Now, the bad thing is that the language and the ideas presented can get complex at times, so it's easy to lose track of what the author is saying. So you do need to be a little on your toes when you're reading this passage. It's not a relaxed, easy read. The first paragraph says that we need to understand the key properties of complex systems, and then it talks about one specific property. It says transitions to orderly states such as schooling in fish. Now, fish are obviously not going to school. All fish swimming in the same direction. This can actually be caused by randomness. So, randomness can produce order. And when I read this, I thought, okay, this is going to be an interesting passage, and I think some of you might feel the same way. Now, I've highlighted part of this paragraph just to focus on the key ideas presented here. The first thing is most of us wouldn't guess that noise can produce predictable behavior. Noise here means randomness. And initially we talked about how the same thing happens in fish, and now we are saying that that is generally true of complex systems. And after that, we are applying it to a very specific situation. Contact tracing apps, they give us local information. They might negatively impact our collective movement. So what is happening is that we are individually trying to avoid other infected people. So at a local or an individual level, we are modifying our behavior. But just like the fish, it might produce a collective pattern, and this collective pattern may impact us negatively. So this paragraph is basically talking about complex systems and how randomness may lead to predictability. The argument here, I found it very difficult to summarize it in a few words because there is a general point and there's a specific application of that point as well. So we are arguing that randomness can create predictability. That was the first general point. And furthermore, technology such as contact tracing apps may generate harmful collective behavior because individuals change their own behavior in order to avoid infection. Let's move on to the second paragraph now. Now, this paragraph starts off by saying that complex systems are vulnerable to events that don't follow a normal distribution or bell curve. Now, what exactly is a bell curve? As the name suggests, it looks like a bell. All right. Now, if I look at this part of the curve, this refers to what we called average, or something that generally happens. So, this side and this side, these are called the tails. These are things which are less likely to happen, less probable, all right. So, this is what you call a tail event. The reason that I am explaining this to you is so that you can understand the vocabulary later on. All right. So, we are trying to say that, some things are distributed normally. For example, it is unusual for a man to be over 7 feet tall, right? So, for example, most adults are between 5 to 6 feet. There would be very, very few people who are around 7 feet, and there is no known person over 9 feet tall. Similarly, there will be fewer people who are less than 5 feet tall. So, that probably will be somewhere on this side. So, these are events that are less likely to happen. So, height is normally distributed. But then it says that in complex systems, there is a much higher probability of extreme events, such as a stock market crash or a massive surge in infections. So, complex systems obviously involves people. So, in the stock market, a crash is more likely, or a rise in infections is also more likely. Under normal circumstances, we would expect that these things don't happen, but extreme or events are more likely in systems which are slightly more complex. And then look at the last line. These events are still unlikely, but they occur more frequently and are larger than would be expected under normal conditions. So now I am going to get rid of this drawing here, and we will try and summarize the argument overall. We're trying to say that in complex systems which are influenced by contagion-like behavior, contagion is kind of like an infection where one person can influence another person. Extreme events occur far more often than a normal bell curve would predict. So, extreme events are more likely in complex systems. These systems are therefore specially vulnerable to disproportionately large disruptions. So far, we've just established that extreme events are more likely in complex systems. Now, let's move on. What's more, once a rare but hugely significant tail event takes place, what is a tail event? It is one of those extreme events. This raises the probability of further tail events. Then it takes the example of stock market gyrations. So, for example, after a big fall, there might be another fall or there might be a sudden rise, or after an earthquake, there might be aftershocks. So, this is just trying to say that one extreme event occurring is more likely to lead to other extreme events occurring. Now, this paragraph is actually fairly simple. It says the dynamics of tail events are complicated by the fact that they result from cascades of other unlikely events. What is a cascade? It is when one thing leads to another. So, event A leads to event B, which in turn can lead to event C, in which event A itself was very unlikely. But since one unlikely event has happened, the second and the third unlikely event might also happen. That's what we established in the previous paragraph. Then it takes the example of the pandemic. First, the pandemic happened, which itself was unlikely. After that, the stock market suffered, so there was a crash in the stock market. This was another unlikely event. After that, the stock market bounced back suddenly. This was another unlikely event. So, when we say that tail events result from cascades of other unlikely events, we are basically saying one thing leads to another. That's all that this paragraph is establishing. In the second half of this paragraph, it actually explains the fall and the recovery. It says that some of these dynamics are attributable to former sports bettors with no sports to bet on. So basically they had nothing to do in that time, so they decided, hey, why not enter the stock market? And so instead of betting on sports, they decided to bet on stocks. Now obviously these people were not very experienced in the stock market. That created even greater volatility, and some people were able to take advantage of that because they were more experienced in the stock market. So the second half is more detailed, it refers to the stocks itself, but the main point here is given to us in the first two lines. So let me just sum up the argument here. All that we are trying to say is that tail events are complex because they are chains of unlikely events. For example, sports bettors entering the market during COVID. Unlikely to have happened, pandemic happened, sports bettors decided to bet in the stock market. Because of that, the market fell and rose. And now this is the last paragraph. One reason a first order tail event can induce further tail events, we talked about a chain of events happening, is that it changes the perceived costs of our actions. Now, let me explain this to you with an example. It's trying to say that the rules by which we play change. So, for example, once the pandemic happened, people started talking about a new normal. What was this new normal? The changed rules by which we would live and exist. So, for example, remote working became a new normal for a lot of people. This game change is an example of another key complex systems concept, non-stationarity. Non-stationarity basically refers to systems adapting to each other. So, in this case, we are trying to explain the facet that one extreme event leads to another extreme event. Why so? One extreme event changes people's behavior, and this change in behavior can produce another extreme event. So, that's all that this paragraph is trying to establish. A major rare event can trigger more rare events because it changes people's behavior and the underlying rules. This is what is called non-stationarity. Now, I looked up this concept a little bit more. It simply means systems adapting to each other, but we don't have to get into that. Let's do a very quick recap and then we will look at the questions. In the first paragraph, we said that in complex systems, randomness can unexpectedly lead to predictable behavior, and then we applied it to contact tracing apps, and we said that when individuals change their behavior at a local level, that might in fact create a predictable large-scale pattern that might be counterproductive. It may actually harm us more than help us. After that, we said that in complex systems driven by contagion-like behavior, extreme events are more likely. After that, we pretty much kept to the same idea that one rare event can increase the probability of other rare events happening. Then we said that tail events or extreme events are complex because they are usually chains or result of chains of other unlikely events. Unlikely event A leads to unlikely event B leads to unlikely event C. And then we said that one major rare event can trigger more rare events because it fundamentally changes the system. It changes the rules by which we play, and this concept is known as non-stationarity. So the big idea simply is that complex systems are prone to rare cascades of events that reshape how the system behaves, and that is why they are complex systems. This question looks like it is a critical reasoning question, but I don't think that it's very difficult. Again, this depends on whether you have understood the main idea or not. Which one of the following observations would most strengthen the passage's claim that a first-order tail event raises the probability of further tail events in complex systems? Now, in our discussion of the passage, I explained what a tail event is. It's an extreme event, something that is unlikely to happen. So, one unlikely event raises the possibility of another unlikely event happening. We have to strengthen this. So, our shadow answer obviously has to provide either a reason or an example or evidence to support this idea. So, remember, one unlikely event has to raise the likelihood of another unlikely event. Our first option says, initial super spreading episodes in epidemic networks are isolated spikes. Okay, so this is our first unlikely event, after which outbreak sizes match the baseline distribution from independent contact models across comparable cities with no rise in the frequency or size of later extreme clusters. So here what has happened is, super spreading episodes are isolated spikes. So this is one extreme event. But has that led to other extreme events or increased the likelihood of other extreme events? No. It says outbreak sizes match the baseline distribution and no rise in the frequency or size of later extreme clusters. So, this does not support our idea that one extreme event raises the possibility of another extreme event, which means option 1 is not our answer. Now, option 2 says river discharge records show water levels fit a normal distribution, regardless of storms or floods. So, storms and floods are going to be our extreme events. After that, the river should fundamentally change. It should lead to other storms and floods. But then that doesn't happen. River discharge records show water levels fit a normal distribution. Things have returned to normal. So, this does not strengthen the idea that one unlikely event leads to other unlikely events. I thought this was fairly easy to eliminate. The third option, after a major equity crash, this is our first extreme event, researchers find dense clusters of large daily moves for several weeks, with extreme days occurring far more often than in normal circumstances. So here what has happened is, there was an equity crash. After that, extreme events have happened more frequently. Extreme days occurring far more often than in normal circumstances. So, one extreme event has led to other extreme events, which is what we were trying to prove. So, option 3 most likely is going to be our answer. The fourth one, following large earthquakes. So, this earthquake becomes our first extreme event. Regional seismic activity returns to baseline within hours. Baseline means normal, with no aftershock sequence. So, after that there is no aftershock, which means that there is no other extreme event triggered by the first extreme event, which means that the fourth option is also not going to support our initial premise. Let's eliminate it. So, our answer, as I said, is supposed to be option 3. I thought this was a fairly easy question, provided you understood what is it that you're trying to strengthen. All of the following inferences are supported by the passage except that. I know that there's an except here, but it's not really a very difficult question. In fact, again, if you have understood the main idea, then this should not be too difficult. Our first option says, examples like runs on banks. What are runs on banks? It's when all the people run to the bank to withdraw their money. And toilet paper scrambles illustrate how contagion can amplify local choices into system-wide cascades. This should sound familiar to us. In the very first paragraph, we talked about how individuals changing their behavior can lead to a large-scale pattern. But for this, we can also look at paragraph 2. This uses pretty much the same words as option 1. A run on the banks, a scramble to buy toilet paper. It says there is a much higher probability of extreme events such as a stock market crash or a massive surge in infections. So what are we basically saying here? That individual behavior leads to a large scale pattern which is pretty extreme. So option 1 is supported by the text and it is generally in line with the main idea of the passage. So let's eliminate it because we're looking for something that does not agree with the passage. The second one says, learning can change the rules that actors face. Now, of course, for this we can think about the first paragraph where the contact tracing apps provide you with information, and because of that information, we might start acting in a way that might be counterproductive. So learning can change the rules that actors face. But there is another aspect that we can look at. Look at paragraph 5. One reason a first tail event can induce further tail events, one extreme event can lead to other extreme events, is that it changes the perceived costs of our actions and changes the rules that we play by. So, learning can change the rules that actors face. A rare shock can alter payoffs and raise the odds of subsequent larger disturbances. A first tail order event can induce further events. That's pretty much what this option is also saying. So option 2 seems to be supported by paragraph 5. And the whole idea that one tail event leads to another tail event is pretty much there throughout the passage. So I don't think we should have any trouble eliminating the second option. The third one, the text attributes the pandemic rebound in financial markets solely to displaced sports bettors. Now, if you have learned anything from all the reading comprehension passages that we've done or you've done, then we should be focused on this word solely. This is something you should check. Look at paragraph 4. Are we saying that the rebound in financial markets was only due to the sports bettors? Not really. It says some of these dynamics are potentially attributable to former sports bettors. So, because of the word solely, I'm already thinking I found my answer. I'm pretty happy about this. Let's keep 3. The fourth one, heavy-tailed events make extreme outcomes more frequent and larger than bell curve expectations. So, heavy-tailed events. We are talking about complex systems which are heavy-tailed, which means the likelihood of extreme events is a little higher in these systems. Larger than bell curve expectations. On the whole, we have said that extreme events are more likely to happen in complex systems. So far, we don't really need support from a specific part of the text. This is something that the passage as a whole has been telling us. This complicates forecasting and risk management in collective settings shaped by contagion and copying behavior. So, for this, just look at this part. Have we been able to predict a run on the banks, a scramble to buy toilet paper? No, not really. Why has this happened? This has happened because people have changed their behavior at a local level. That has produced an overall pattern which may have been a little difficult to foresee. So, from paragraph 2 as well as the rest of the passage, we can say that heavy-tailed events make extreme outcomes more frequent.
This complicates forecasting and risk management, not specifically given in the passage, but when we say complex systems, then yes, in a way that means that these systems are a little difficult to predict or manage. So as far as I can see, option 4 seems to agree with the passage, not specifically with those words, but definitely not the answer. So we go back to option 3, and it is because I was very confident about option 3 that I was so happily eliminating option 4. So option 3 becomes the right choice. Now this question here is asking for an assumption. So the moment I see this, I'm thinking this might be a scary question. But at the same time, I have understood the passage so well, I'm thinking I'll give this a shot. The passage suggests that contact tracing apps could inadvertently raise risky interactions by altering local behavior. Which one of the assumptions below is most necessary for that suggestion to hold? So I am going to take a look at the paragraph. And based on this paragraph, I would say that we are trying to say individual actions here can produce a collective pattern that might be harmful to us. So what is the individual action? Avoiding infected people. So we are trying to all avoid infected people because the contact tracing app is giving us information on who is infected. But overall, that might lead to a pattern where we might be putting asymptomatic people together, or where we might be actually increasing the risk of infection. So let's keep this in mind. We definitely need to support this conclusion. We cannot go against it. We also cannot pick an option that is irrelevant to this conclusion. Our first option says, individuals base movement choices partly on observed infections and the behavior of others. So what is happening is that other people's behavior is influencing our behavior. So that's okay. So local responses interact, which turns many small adjustments into large-scale patterns. So this has at least the basics of what I was looking for. Many small adjustments turn into large-scale patterns that can frustrate the intended aim of risk reduction. That's exactly what the paragraph is also saying. So we like the first option because it more or less supports the idea that contact tracing apps might actually produce more risky behavior. So let's keep one. The second one says, urban networks have uniform traffic conditions at all hours, which allows perfectly predictable routing independent of personal choices, and therefore makes interdependence negligible. Now this goes against the idea that another person's behavior is going to influence my behavior. It is because our behaviors are interdependent that that large pattern is going to be produced. But if you're saying that interdependence is negligible, that my behavior is not going to influence anyone else, then how will that large scale pattern be produced? So option 2 is not going to be our answer. The third option says, app alerts always include precise location to within 1 meter and deliver real-time updates for all users. So I'm not going to read the whole option. What I understood by this is that we are saying that information is very, very precise and accurate. But is that necessary for that large behavior pattern to be produced? No. All that we need is people changing individual behavior on the basis of other people's behavior. That might happen on the basis of inaccurate data also. I don't need absolutely perfect data for that large pattern to emerge. So option 3 is not an assumption because even if data is inaccurate, individual changes in behavior can produce a larger pattern. So let's eliminate 3. The fourth option says most users uninstall apps within a week. Now imagine what would happen then, which leaves only highly exposed individuals participating. This neutralizes any systematic bias in routing decisions, prevents any predictable change. So, if there is no predictable change in aggregate contact patterns, this clearly tells me that individual behavior is not producing any large-scale change. This goes against the idea that a contact tracing app may cause individuals to change their behavior, thereby producing a larger pattern. So, option 4 we can eliminate, which means that my answer has to be the first option. Now this question is something you should love because it's very short. Which one of the options below best summarizes the passage? We'll obviously take a look at the passage recap, but even if you haven't done a passage recap, which I'm sure you didn't, you should still have the main idea in mind. We're talking about complex systems how individual behavior can produce a larger pattern, how one extreme event can lead to other extreme events. That's basically what the passage talks about. Now, let's take a look at our first option. The passage explains how non-stationarity works in evolutionary biology. The concept of non-stationarity was discussed here. Rejects applications in markets or public health. But we have talked about how in markets and public health, we talked about the stock market crash and we talked about the pandemic, the same pattern operates. So we cannot say that the first option is accurate because the moment it says rejects applications in markets or public health, that's not true. In fact, we are trying to say it's very applicable to markets and public health. The second option says, the passage explains how social outcomes generally follow normal distributions. Okay, I mean, I don't like the first sentence, but still, so extreme events are negligible. But in fact, we are trying to say that in complex systems, extreme events are more likely to happen. So, I would reject the second option. The third option says the passage explains how noise can create order. That was what we discussed here. Noise can create order. Shows why complex systems with contagion are vulnerable to heavy-tailed cascades. That is discussed here. It also explains why early shocks change the rules through non-stationarity with a market illustration during the COVID-19 disruption. So this seems to be a perfect summary of the entire passage. We like 3. The fourth option says the passage explains how speculative entrants always produce inefficiency. Now, here we are clearly talking about the sports bettors who joined the stock market or who started participating in the stock market during COVID. Therefore, long-term investors invariably profit when new participants push prices away. Now, we don't like the fourth option for 2 reasons. First of all, how speculative entrants always produce inefficiency. Even when we did talk about the sports bettors, we said that it can be partially attributed to those. That's one. Second, always and invariably, pretty extreme words. So I would say option 4 is not so great. So our answer is going to be option 3. This is a very easy question. I would rate this passage on the easier end of the difficulty spectrum. The reason is that the language is pretty easy. The questions are not always straightforward, but I think they're definitely logical. So if you have practiced your RC enough, then I think this could be a scoring passage. In the first paragraph, it seems that we are talking about the 19th century because we are talking about a legal thinker who wrote a book in 1863. James Fitzjames Stephen, among the most celebrated legal thinkers of his generation, felt that assessment of a person's mental state was an inference made with little consciousness. What that means is that when you try to figure out what a person is thinking or feeling, a lot of times there is not enough justification or information to support whatever ideas you might have. And after that, it says that you could look for clues. Obviously, you could observe the defendants and so on, but ultimately you can't be sure. Then it says that the closer the resemblance between defendants and their judges, the easier it was to overlook the gap that the inference filled. What that means is that when a person was similar to the judges, then it was slightly easier for them to infer how that person might be thinking or feeling. And I think that's common sense. We are more likely to be able to empathize with someone who is similar to us and maybe understand what their life is like. But when there was a significant difference between the defendants and the officials, then the inferences about their state of mind were prone to error. That is what it means when it says the precariousness of judgments about mental state was exposed. So when someone is very different from you, how are you supposed to figure out what's going on in their mind? Because you may not have the same thoughts as them. So overall, the topic here is assessment of a defendant's mental state. And we're obviously talking about this from the legal point of view. The argument that is being made is that judging a defendant's mental state relied on inferences, and these inferences became unreliable when the defendants were different from those who were judging them. In this paragraph, we are saying that the field of mental science emerged in the 19th century, apparently. there were a new set of physicians who specialized in the study of madness and care of the insane. And these physicians were called alienists or mad doctors. It says that lawyers for the prosecution and defense began to recruit alienists to assess defendants' sanity and to testify to it in court. So, at one point of time, whether someone was sane or insane was a matter of public opinion. Their families or friends judged them, and that opinion of the community used to be enough. But in the 19th century, when these alienists came to be around, lawyers of both sides started using these alienists to testify in court because they needed someone to substantiate those inferences about a defendant's mental state. So, the argument here is that in the 19th century, the court started relying on specialized physicians to evaluate the defendant's sanity. And that is something that we still do, so that practice started fairly early on and continues till present day. This paragraph focuses on how the fields of law and medical science began to overlap because they were both dealing with criminal responsibility and insanity. So, the first two sentences tell us that fundamentally criminal responsibility was a legal concept. It was not a medical one. But then you have to understand why there is an overlap. If a person is insane, then we cannot hold them responsible for their criminal acts. So, you need to first assess that the person is fully in control of their faculties, or at least partly in control of their faculties, in order to assign responsibility or blame to them. And that is why the definition of insanity had to be made or constructed in some way. Now, look at this line from here. Ultimately, the fields of criminal law and mental science were both invested in constructing an image of the broken and damaged psyche that could be contrasted with the whole and healthy one. Because if a person could clearly be certified as insane, then they were not criminally responsible. If on the other hand they were completely sane, then they held criminal responsibility. So there was clearly some effort being made to define the border between sanity and insanity. This shared interest and the shared space of the criminal courtroom made it nearly impossible to consider responsibility without medicine or insanity without law. So in this paragraph, as I said, we are simply trying to say that though legal responsibility and insanity were supposed to be separate ideas, in the 19th century, law and medical science started overlapping. They became intertwined so much that you could not really define insanity or responsibility without the other concept or without interacting with the other field. In this paragraph, we are saying that physicians and lawyers were similar in certain ways, class, race, gender, and so on. But they also had disagreements. The men of medicine and law were divided by contests over the borders of criminal responsibility as much within each profession as between them. So, what we are saying in this paragraph basically is that physicians and lawyers disagreed with each other and within their own professions over how broadly to define insanity and where to draw the line of criminal responsibility. So, as you can see, medical science or particularly alienists were trying to push the boundaries of their field. They were trying to give insanity a very, very broad definition, whereas there were some others who probably resisted those borders. And because of this, there was a lot of disagreement. That is all that we are establishing here. So, now let's do a very quick recap. In the first paragraph, we said that judging a defendant's mental state involved inferences. And these inferences were not very reliable when the judges and the defendants were very different from each other. Then we said that in the 19th century, the court started relying on specialized physicians. These were doctors who specialized in the mind, and they were required to evaluate and testify about defendant's sanity. The next paragraph said that insanity and responsibility were supposedly separate ideas, but around that time, there was a great deal of overlap between medical science and law because both of them were trying to figure out the definition of insanity and what criminal responsibility entails. In the last paragraph, we said that physicians and lawyers disagreed with each other with regard to the definition of insanity and criminal responsibility. But not only did they disagree with each other, they also disagreed among themselves in the same profession. So all in all, this passage is simply trying to say that in the 19th century, determining someone's mental state became a very complicated and debatable process, which involved both lawyers and physicians. So it seems to be more of a descriptive passage than anything else, and that is why it was pretty easy to read. Now this question looks like it could take time, but I found it very, very interesting, and I thought it's a very intelligently framed question as well. So what it's asking you is that in this sentence, which of the following best describes the use of the word confession? So it's not asking you for the meaning of the word. It is asking you, what does this word signify in this sentence? So in a way, it's meaning in context, which is why it's not a vocabulary question. It is a logical question. So the way that you're supposed to look at it is by assessing the structure of the sentence. So what I would notice is that in this sentence, we are trying to say that sometimes the defendants were different from the officials due to disease, gender, confession or race. So in this sentence, confession has been grouped along with disease, gender and race as qualities that distinguish the defendants from the officials judging them. So the way that I would reason this out is to say, okay, so then confession will refer to a personal characteristic that can differentiate the defendant from the official. It has to be a personal trait. If you have reached this degree of reasoning, then I think the answer is pretty clear. After that, you simply need to stick to your logic and not be distracted by anything else. The first option says, referring to the practice of confession in some faiths, here it is a metaphor for the religion of the defendant. Could religion be a characteristic that differentiates the defendant from the officials? Yes. Confession could denote religion. So I would say option 1 kind of matches my idea. The second one says, referring to the defendant's confession of his or her crime as false. But this refers to confession as an action, whereas we wanted to refer to confession as a personal trait. But there is one more reason that we should reject too. Didn't is an archaic form of didn't or did not. Now, I'm not sure if you know this, but in this sentence, didn't seems to be equal to because of or by reason of. So it doesn't really seem to be a form of didn't or did not. So for both those reasons, I would eliminate 2. The third option says, referring to gender, race or disease claimed as a defense by the defendant. But here we are just trying to point to differences between defendants and officials. We are not saying that the defendant is trying to claim innocence by referring to these things. So this seems to misinterpret the sentence entirely. That is why option 3 is not the correct answer. The fourth one is a ridiculous option. The defendants struck out at the officials. We don't know if the defendants attacked the officials. At least the sentence does not suggest that. So I think option 4 is very easy to eliminate. So our answer is going to be option 1. As I said, if you can reach a certain level of reasoning and then look at the options, it's far, far easier. But if you simply look at the options, then you might just end up picking something like option 2. In any case, the answer that you're supposed to pick is option 1. What I like about this question is that it's short. And I also think that it's not very difficult to solve. So if you have understood the passage, you should be able to do this. Study the following sets of concepts and identify the set that is conceptually closest to the concerns and arguments of the passage. I see this as a key idea sort of a question. I mean, it could have just asked you for the thought flow of the passage and it would pretty much take the same approach. So we're going to look at the recap. What I've done is that I've highlighted the main words in each paragraph so that we can refer to them when we are assessing our answers. So in the first paragraph, we talked about evaluating or assessing a defendant's mental state. In the second paragraph, we introduced the role of alienists. Then we talked about responsibility and insanity, and we continue to talk about that. So let's keep this in mind. Now the first option starts off with empathy. But in the first paragraph, we are not really saying that the officials empathized with the defendants. The focus is on assessing or judging. So on that basis, it is definitely not the first option. Now, let's look at the second and third and fourth. Judgment and assessment. This could definitely justify the first paragraph. So now I am going to move on to the second paragraph. The second paragraph refers to alienists who could testify about the defendant's sanity. So on that basis, now I would look at option 4. We are not talking about empathy in the second paragraph. So maybe it is not the fourth option. Another reason that I would eliminate the fourth option is that nowhere are we really focusing on patriotism as the main idea. So I think this option is pretty easy to eliminate. Now we are left with 2 and 3. So between 2 and 3, I would be more inclined to go with the word insanity, because here also the alienists are being used to testify about the defendant's sanity. After that, we have talked about medical insanity and we have talked about criminal responsibility. Now, these words are there in the third option. The third option does not really talk about criminal responsibility, it does not talk about sanity or insanity. So, now second option is out. Option 3 therefore becomes the right choice. Now, of course, we have done this by process of elimination. The word punishment has not really been used in a big way in the passage. It's kind of implied that if you're held criminally responsible, then you will be punished. But I would have picked the third option primarily on the basis of judgment, insanity and responsibility. And as you can see, option elimination works really well here. This is a very simple question. According to the passage, who or what was an alienist? Now, alienists or mad doctors were predecessors of modern psychiatrists, neurologists and psychologists. So, they specialized in the study of madness and care of the insane. The answer is directly given to us. So, please remember that they were physicians. This itself can help you out quite a bit. Our first option says physicians and lawyers who were responsible for examining accounts of extraterrestrials. Now, here they are called alienists, but they are not actually judging extraterrestrials. So, option 1 I think is pretty bad. You should get rid of it straight away. Now, option 2 says professionals who pushed the boundaries of their fields till they became unrecognizable in the 19th century. Look at paragraph 4. Alienists steadily pushed the boundaries of their field because they were trying to develop very broad definitions of insanity. So, to some extent 2 is true, they did push the boundaries of their fields. But option 2 doesn't tell us who are they. For example, it just says professionals, it doesn't even tell us that they are physicians. Apart from that, till they became unrecognizable is not supported by the passage. So, option 2 is a bad option, let's eliminate it. The third one says physicians who specialized in the study of madness and the care of the insane. If you read paragraph 2, you know that this is the answer. So, we keep 3. The fourth one, physicians and lawyers who were responsible for the condition of immigrants or aliens in the 19th century. Clearly, we know that they did not concern themselves with immigrants. This is just trying to play on words a little bit, because sometimes people from other countries are also called aliens, creatures from other planets are also called aliens, but obviously they are not called alienists for any of those reasons. So, let's eliminate option 4. So, our answer has to be option 3. Very, very simple question. This question is interesting because the answer to this is not very direct. The last paragraph of the passage refers to middle class white professional men. Which one of the following qualities best describes the connection among them? So, when I read the question, I thought, okay, what is this actually asking? So, I went back to the text, obviously. It says that they shared more than just concern for the mind. So, one of the things that links them is concern for the mind. They were similar in many ways, class, race, gender and so on. After that, it says, but for all their affinities, men of medicine and law were divided by contests over borders of criminal responsibility. So, what are the things that are linking all of these people together? Concern for the mind, and debate about criminal responsibility. So having understood this much, let's take a look at the options. The borders of criminal responsibility, were they all concerned about it? Yes, they were, because we've already seen in the other paragraphs that the fields of medicine and law started overlapping. Even though criminal responsibility was supposedly a legal concept, physicians called alienists also became involved. So option 1 could work. The second one says eccentricity and aggression. This only refers to alienists who were trying to say that insanity has a very broad definition, so even eccentric and aggressive behavior should qualify a person as insane. But this does not really tell us what linked all of these people together. It was not eccentricity and aggression, so let's eliminate 2. The third one says empathy and imagination. Empathy and imagination are just words that have been used elsewhere in the passage, but not in the context of these middle class professional men. So not 3. The fourth one, opinions of family and neighbors. This has been used in the passage to refer to the fact that at one time this was enough to classify a person as insane. But again, this does not link these middle class white professional men. So option 4 is out. Which means that by process of elimination, I think it's very easy to reach option 1, which is our answer. Here we have a parajumble that can be solved. So after some of the other questions in this test, this was quite refreshing. Now, look at the first statement, but man, woman or otherwise. So, this is clearly trying to say that I have already made a few points earlier and now I want to make a more general point. So, I know that 1 is definitely a follower. The second one says, once the taboos have been broken. So, when I say once the taboos have been broken, it seems a little abrupt because I should probably say what taboos are broken. And then it says women usually experience letting their fists fly as intensely liberating. Again, why are women punching other people? So a bit abrupt, we would probably need some context before we put sentence 2. So this is definitely a follower. Now the third one, this looks like a starter. Though this might seem a stereotype, women are often socialized to keep a lid on their ire. So this is telling us that, men are allowed to give free rein to their aggression, but women are told to keep their anger in check. Even though it seems like a stereotype, it is actually true. So I would say could be the starter. Now look at 4. Many of them are so at odds with their aggressive feelings that as a coach, I have to stop them from pulling their punches. Now, them here clearly refers to the women that are mentioned in 3. And because they're socialized to keep a lid on their anger, therefore they have to be coached to actually let their punches hit the target because they're used to holding their aggression back. So they have to be encouraged to let it out. So the fourth one clearly refers to 3. The pronoun them refers to the women. So I have found my first mandatory pair, which is 3 and 4. And at this point, I'm feeling very confident that I'll be able to solve this. So I found the starter, I have found my mandatory pair. Now all I need to figure out is what to do with 1 and 2. Now let's see if we can figure out what to do about the rest of the sequence. So far we have 3 and 4 at the beginning. Now look at 2 very carefully. Once the taboos have been broken. Why are the taboos broken? Because as a coach, this person encourages women to actually punch their target, to not hold back their aggression anymore. So once that taboo is broken, women usually experience letting their fists fly as intensely liberating. So the taboo that is mentioned here actually refers to whatever we have said in 3 and furthermore whatever they are now being coached to do in the 4th one. And it is because of the coaching that the women feel liberated. So as far as I can see, I now have a 3-4-2 sequence. Now, there is no other space for 1 except at the end. Plus, it seems to make sense because it's a more general comment saying that ultimately the quality of our life is related to the way we handle our anger. So far, we've been talking about women, but for men also it's applicable. So 1 goes at the end, which means that the answer now is going to be 3-4-2-1. I thought this was a fairly easy question to solve. Now here we have a paragraph completion question. The reason that you can only see one sentence is that we're going to do the before and after method. This is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to read the given sentence, try and predict what kind of text should come before and after it, and then look at the paragraph. This usually helps. So the sentence is, historically, silver has been and still is an important element in the business of show, visible in private houses, churches, government and diplomacy. This looks like it could be a starting sentence. So I would say that before there does not need to be anything really. After this, I might want to explain how or why it is an important element of show. So I have my before and after done. Not very helpful because I don't really know what kind of text comes before it, but at least I have some semblance of what I'm looking for. Now let's take a look at the paragraph. Now here, my first guess would be to say, oh, there is space right at the beginning, so let me just put this sentence as the starter. But if you read the paragraph carefully, and you should, you will realize that the given sentence, regardless of how appropriate it seems, is not going to fit. The reason for that is that after blank 1, we are actually talking about some need being eroded. Even the sentence after that, it says that silver, when it is illuminated by candlelight, comes alive. But when lit by electric light, it becomes flat and dead. So again, these sentences are talking about why the domestic need for silver has probably declined. Whereas the given sentence is saying that it has been and still is an important element in the business of show, visible in private houses, churches and other places. So the next two sentences do not talk about how silver is good for show. It actually talks about how people are probably not going to show off their silver anymore. So that is why option 1 is not going to be our answer. Now let's look at 2. Just before 2, we have already talked about the declining domestic need for silver. So after that, it doesn't make sense to say that silver is very important for show. Look at the sentence after blank 2. Domestic and economic changes may have worked against the market. So this part of the sentence also talks about the declining domestic demand for silver, which means that I cannot put the given sentence here. It is at odds with the sentences before and after. We want to say silver is still important, whereas these sentences are saying it doesn't seem to be all that showy or important anymore. So let's get rid of option 2. So far in the paragraph, we have talked about how domestic demand for silver has declined. Now, look at this part. But the London silver trade remained buoyant thanks to competition of collectors seeking grand display silver at the top end and buyers of collectibles at the bottom. This sentence clearly tells us that silver was still in demand, which supports the idea in the given sentence that historically silver has been and still is an important element in the business of show. So collectors want to show it off and other buyers of collectibles also want to show it off, which means that option 3 might actually be a good spot for the given sentence. Even after the third blank, we are saying that there was another factor that came into play to support the silver market in London, which was the systematic collection building of certain American museums. So in both of these sentences, we are talking about how certain people still value silver for display. That means I am going to keep the third option open. Now, it seems like this given sentence could be the conclusion because it just feels like it's a concluding sentence, right? Historically, silver has been and still is an important element. But you have to be a little careful. You see, this given sentence here is a pretty generic one. But look at what we are ending with here. We are talking about collection building by certain American museums, which is a very, very specific use to which the silver is being put. So here we are changing the scale of discussion a little bit. We are not going to put in a very specific sentence and then suddenly jump to this general conclusion. And that is why option 4 is not the best spot. So again, I understand that a lot of us might feel that this is a better concluding sentence, but you always have to see whether the conclusion connects to the sentence just before it, which it really doesn't. But when I pick the third blank, I have a sentence which is positive before and a sentence which is positive after. So based on this, option 3 is a slightly better choice. Now if you look at the options, option 3 is actually here. So we have to pick option 1 if we want to choose blank 3. Now here we have a summary question. On the whole, this seems to be a descriptive sort of text, so it shouldn't be very difficult to read. We should follow the XYZ strategy just to make sure that we have covered all our main points. So the first thing that I would do is divide this paragraph into 3 parts. In the first part, we are saying that zombie cells can contribute to age-related chronic inflammation. This seems to be the general finding, and we are saying that somehow this can help us understand the aging process and also figure out how the immune system becomes less effective as we get older. So we're talking about zombie cells, age-related changes, and how the immune system becomes less effective with age. The second part says, zombie or senescent cells are damaged cells that can no longer divide and grow like normal cells. So what do? Apparently, they contribute to chronic health problems and they accumulate in the body. Why do they accumulate in the body? The immune system is much more effective when we are younger. But as we age, this process called apoptosis becomes less efficient. As a result, there is accumulation of senescent or zombie cells in different organs of the body. So this part is simply saying that as we age, these zombie cells accumulate in our body either due to increased production or due to reduced apoptosis by the immune system. The last part is telling us how these zombie cells contribute to inflammation. They use energy and they release inflammatory chemicals. This contributes to long-term inflammation and chronic diseases. So as you can see, it's not a very difficult para to read. All we have to now do is look at the options. We have to talk about zombie cells, we have to talk about inflammation, we might have to talk about accumulation of these cells and somehow how it contributes to long-term chronic diseases. So, our first option says, a younger person's immune system is healthy and is able to clear the damaged cells. But as people age, the zombie cells resist apoptosis and start accumulating in the body. Now, this pretty much deals with point number Y. But it doesn't talk about inflammation. And so it misses the point. What are we talking about? We are talking about zombie cells and how they contribute to chronic inflammation in the body. And we are missing out on that. So option 1 is not our answer. The second one says dead cells. Now the moment you read this, you should also check the text. Zombie cells are not dead cells. It says that they are damaged cells. So option 2 is in any case inaccurate. They accelerate chronic inflammation, weakening the immune system and lead to aging. So the rest of it may or may not be true, but as far as the first 2 words go, I'm pretty sure that this is not going to be the answer. Now, option 3 says that zombie cells are inactive or malfunctioning cells that can be found throughout the body. Misses out on the chronic inflammation part and therefore option 3 is incomplete. Let's get rid of it. Option 4 says aging leads to less effective apoptosis. We have already discussed this. This is our point Y. Therefore, zombie cells start to accumulate in the body, also true. They cause inflammation, that has been discussed here and here, which accelerates aging and leads to chronic diseases. So, we've covered all 3 points. As far as I can see, option 4 is the best choice. Also very easy to see that option 4 is the right answer. This one is a sneaky question. If you're not careful, you'll fall for the trap option. So obviously we have to find the odd sentence here, for which we can use the labeling technique. But for this question, I found that unless you also looked at the sequence, you are probably not going to find the right answer. And that's why I said that it's a sneaky question. So what we're going to do is, of course, we'll read each sentence and try and find out what it's talking about. We'll definitely look for an overall theme. But at the end, we will still have to do a bit of sequencing. The first sentence says, developments both technological and socio-cultural have afforded us far greater freedom over death than we had in the past. So now we have more freedom over death than we did in the past. So that's pretty much my label for this sentence. The second one says, but I believe that a type of freedom we can call freedom over death should be central to this conversation. Now, I would look at 2 and I would say, of course, this looks like a follower sentence. Here, we are saying that we should discuss a specific type of freedom, which is freedom over death. So, this sentence must follow something else. What that first sentence is going to be, that we'll figure out later. But for now, we'll just say that this is talking about freedom over death and what it should mean. The third one says that legally assisted dying is a step in realizing freedom over death. So, fairly simple to understand. Option 4 talks about people's endorsement. So, here we are simply trying to say that many people believe that freedom over death should now include medically assisted dying. And the fifth one only talks about how freedom is a complex notion. Now, if I were to do this really quickly without double checking what I have thought, I would say option 5 is the odd one out, because everything else talks about freedom over death, right? And I'm pretty sure that a lot of you in fact marked option 5 as the answer. I would have too, except that I always do that double check where I check whether the rest of it makes sense. For example, remember I told you that the second statement seems like it is a follow-up to another. Now, before I can say, but I believe that a type of freedom we can call freedom over death should be central to this conversation. In this sentence, I am saying that we should also be talking about freedom over death, which means that before that, I am going to talk about freedom in general. So, what you're supposed to realize here is that there is a 5-2 link. Now, if you don't realize this, then you will obviously say that 5 is the odd one out. But the moment you connect 5 and 2, then you'll start searching for another possibility. So yes, our theme undoubtedly is the progress that we have made towards gaining freedom over death. But most of the sentences here assume one type of tone. Look at sentence 5. I won't pretend to settle any of the big controversies it raises. So, the tone is slightly personal and the author is saying that, look, I cannot decide what freedom is in a big way. After 5, we go to 2. But I believe that a type of freedom we can call freedom over death should be central to this conversation. So, here we are definitely saying that we should be talking about freedom over death. So, in general, the author is saying that this is a step in the right direction. This is the direction in which we should be moving. The first statement should follow 2. Some developments have given us far greater freedom over death than we had in the past. So, we are moving in the right direction. 3 gives us an example of some of these developments. Legalized assisted dying is a step in the right direction. Only one of these statements talks about how the public feels about freedom over death. Look at option 4. Many people endorse our freedom over death encompassing a right to medical assistance. So far, everything else was personal. It was from the author's point of view that we should be talking about freedom over death. It's an important type of freedom. We have made some progress in that direction. And only in one sentence, we are talking about people's endorsements. So, sentence 4, therefore, is the odd sentence. It's not an easy answer to derive, and I would completely understand if you chose option 5 as your answer. But if you form the sequence, then you might be able to see that option 5 has to be an essential part of it. And that is how we start searching for something else. So, the correct choice is option 4. So, here we have an odd sentence question. We're going to be using labeling in order to solve it, which means we'll read each sentence and we'll try and figure out what the sentence is about. But at the same time, it will help if we form mandatory pairs just to know which 2 sentences go together. And if you're able to form 2 mandatory pairs, then we will know what the odd one out is. Now, there are some French sounding names here, so I'm not going to pronounce them because they're a little scary for me. But apart from that, I'm going to read out the whole option. So, the first statement says that the tapestry was therefore an obvious way to tell people about the downfall of the English and the rise of the Normans. So, here we're talking about some sort of tapestry and how it signified something. The second one says that if we take expert in Anglo-Saxon culture Gail Owen Crocker's idea, then the tapestry was originally hung in a square with certain scenes facing each other. So, here we're talking about the placement of the tapestry. The third one talks about how pre-Renaissance people interacted with art. So that becomes the topic for the third statement. Now look at the fourth one. The fourth one says that would make it an 11th century immersive space. So when I say that would make it, it means I have done something, and because of that it becomes an immersive artistic experience. So here all that I am trying to say is that the placement of the tapestry has transformed it into an immersive space. So 4 most likely refers to 2, where the tapestry was hung in a square with certain scenes facing each other, and therefore this will become an immersive space with scenes corresponding and echoing each other. So I have my first mandatory pair, which is 2 and 4. Now let's take a look at the fifth statement. The tapestry would have been hung at eye level to enable this. Now when I say to enable this, what are we trying to do? Probably we are referring to option 3 or statement 3 here. In 3, we are saying that the pre-Renaissance people interacted with art visually, kinesthetically and physically. So in order to enable this kind of interaction, probably the tapestry was hung at eye level. So as far as I can see, the fifth statement refers to 2. So I have my the fifth statement refers to 3. So I have my second mandatory pair. I have connected 2 and 4, I have connected 3 and 5. My overall theme is pretty basic. We are talking about the placement of the tapestry to create an immersive experience. There is only one thing that does not talk about the artistic angle here, which is the first statement, and that is why I think it's very easy to say that option 1 is the odd sentence. Here we have a summary question. I would say it's a fairly easy one. The language is not very difficult, but the options make life a lot easier. So what we'll do is, we will first figure out our main points and then we will take a look at the options. The first thing that I do is I divide the paragraph mentally. Here I will show it to you on the screen. So the first part here says that artists have to walk the fine line between artistic inspiration that they derive from other cultures and crossing into the territory of cultural appropriation. So don't worry if you don't know what cultural appropriation is, it explains it. In the second half, we are saying that sometimes inspiration is good if it is done with respect. In such a case, it may actually foster appreciation of cultural diversity. So then inspiration is good. But sometimes the line between inspiration and appropriation can be easily blurred. So when does it become cultural appropriation? It becomes cultural appropriation when elements from a particular culture are borrowed without proper understanding, respect or acknowledgement. So this becomes our second point, that sometimes inspiration is good. It can foster or enhance our appreciation of cultural diversity. But cultural appropriation takes place when we borrow things from another culture without acknowledgement or without respect. In the third part, we are saying that cultural appropriation has negative consequences. For example, commodification of sacred symbols, reinforcement of stereotypes. But what I would really take away from here is this part, because it says it's essential to, right? So when it says it's essential to, they probably want us to remember that. So this part says that impact of cultural appropriation extends beyond the realm of artistic expression. So this becomes my third point, that cultural appropriation can lead to negative consequences beyond the field of art. Now I have my main points. I will now take a look at the options. The first option actually looks pretty good to me because it says they must navigate the thin line between inspiration and cultural appropriation. This becomes my point X, so that's there. Where respectful inspiration fosters cultural understanding, but appropriation involves borrowing without acknowledgement. So that becomes my point Y. Leading to commodification and reinforcement of stereotypes. This is mentioned in the last part of the paragraph in my subdivisions. In a way, it is referring to the negative consequences. So option 1 looks decent to me. I'm going to keep it. The second one says, in today's world of creativity, artists have to decide between acknowledging works that are inspired by diverse cultures and appropriating elements without respect for those contexts. There are so many things wrong with this option that I can't even count them. First of all, this does not really talk about how they have to walk the fine line. It's not like you actively decide, I am going to be inspired or I am going to practice cultural appropriation. 2 makes it seem like a very deliberate choice. Whereas here, we're trying to say that sometimes inspiration is good, but sometimes it can end up badly.
The other reason I would not pick 2 is that it doesn't really talk about the consequences of cultural appropriation. So I think option 2 is pretty easy to eliminate. The third one says artists in a globalized world must navigate between drawing inspiration from diverse cultures respectfully and cultural appropriation. So this becomes my first part. Now, cultural appropriation involves borrowing without proper acknowledgement. So that becomes my second part. It has broader societal impacts, including perpetuating power imbalances. This talks about the consequences of cultural appropriation. So that becomes my third part. Now, there was one thing here that did create a bit of doubt. Globalized world. It doesn't actively say globalized world as far as I could remember, but at the same time I thought that if you're able to derive inspiration from other cultures, then the world must be globalized, so it's kind of implied. So then I didn't worry about it so much. So I would keep 3 as well. Now look at 4. In a globalized world, this gave me more confidence that if there are 2 options that say globalized world, probably it's okay. Artists must draw from diverse cultural influences to create works that appeal to all. This results in instances of both inspiration and cultural appropriation. So again, so many things wrong with this. It doesn't really tell us what cultural appropriation is. It also does not talk about the impact of cultural appropriation. So 4 is easy to get rid of. Now I am stuck between 1 and 3, equally lengthy options. But again, remember I told you that when in the paragraph they tell you that something is essential, it means it is essential. So what was essential? Point number Z, that it can lead to negative consequences beyond the realm of art. Now, where is this point covered? If you look at 1, it does not specifically say that. It just says commodification and reinforcement of stereotypes, which is true. It is given to us in the passage. But there is only one option that talks about broader societal impact, which is option 3. So now I can eliminate option 1 and say option 3 is the right choice. The best thing about this passage is that it's only 2 paragraphs. Agreed that the 2 paragraphs are a little lengthy, and also agreed that it's really boring when you read it. But once you get past that boredom, you realize that it's actually fairly simple in what it's trying to tell you. Now, I've highlighted the main parts that I would have focused on if I were reading. So the first part says that studies showing income inequality plays a positive role in economic growth are largely based on 3 arguments. So here we're actually trying to support a view that a lot of us may not be very happy with. Income inequality plays a positive role in economic growth. And we're saying that these studies are based on 3 claims or 3 arguments. So obviously the author is then going to enumerate and explain these 3 arguments. The first one says that investment indivisibilities are involved when implementing new fundamental innovations. What does that mean in simple English? That when you're trying to do something big or you are trying to innovate, you need large amounts of money. And where will the large amounts of money come from? Obviously, they will have to come from people who have large amounts of money. So that is one way in which income inequality can actually promote economic growth. So that's what is explained in the next few lines. Now there is some other data. It says that using system GMM, another study estimated the relation between income inequality and economic growth for 106 countries. The results show that income inequality has a positive impact on economic growth in the short run, but the two are negatively correlated in the long run. So here we are saying that there is some data to suggest that income inequality may not always lead to economic growth, particularly in the long run. But the focus of this paragraph is on those 3 arguments, the 3 arguments that support the idea that income inequality can promote economic growth. So the first one simply related to the fact that sometimes we require large investments, and that will have to come from wealthy individuals. The second argument, I'm reading from here now, is related to moral hazard and incentives. Now, when you read this sentence, honestly, you will not understand what it's talking about. When I read the next 2 lines also, I don't quite understand, but after a little bit of processing, I realized that we are trying to say that effort is not something that you can observe, right? So when you pay people for effort, that's going to be a little arbitrary. How do I decide who has put in more effort and who has put in less? So when you pay people, it has to be on the basis of output. It cannot be on the basis of effort. So that is one argument. And then it says that income inequality can actually promote worker motivation.
certain income inequalities contribute to growth by enhancing worker motivation and by giving motivation to innovators and entrepreneurs. So, for example, if I have been able to set up a successful business, the output is fantastic. So, in return for that, I do need to get paid a large amount of money. So, in that way, income inequality is justified because we pay people according to output, not according to effort. Another thing is that if someone has, say, more money than I do, then I might be motivated to put in more effort in order to generate more output so that I can earn more money. So, somehow it also has a motivational impact. Now, I'm not sure if I understood it correctly, but that's kind of what I thought it was saying. After that, it says, finally, another study points out that concentration of wealth or stock ownership in relation to corporate governance contributes to growth. This one is fairly easy to understand because it's explained. See, if stock ownership is distributed, if there are a lot of shareholders, then decision making is obviously going to be a little complicated, right? This may also cause a free rider problem in terms of monitoring and supervising managers and workers. So, we basically want stocks or ownership of wealth to be concentrated so that decision making is easier and so that we know who is accountable. That's pretty much it. So, in this paragraph, the topic obviously is role of income inequality in economic growth, and the argument here is that income inequality can promote economic growth in the short and the medium run because of three possible reasons. Concentrated wealth helps to fund large investments. This was our first argument. It creates strong incentives for effort and innovation. This was our second argument. Improves corporate governance. This was our third argument. But we also acknowledge that some studies have shown that this positive effect of income inequality does not last in the long run. Now, we move on to the second paragraph, which according to me is a lot easier. Here, we get back to the view that we are all probably very comfortable with. Various studies have examined the relationship between income inequality and economic growth, and most of these assert that a negative correlation exists between the two. This is what we would normally expect, right? If there is a lot of inequality in society, it should not promote economic growth, it should probably hinder it. And that somehow seems fair to us. But in the first paragraph, we are arguing from the other direction. But we might also be saying that in the short and medium run, maybe inequality promotes growth, but in the long run, it does not. So maybe that is what the author is trying to say. Either way, after this line, there is some data that suggests that when there is greater inequality, GDP falls. When there is less inequality, GDP grows. So it is just supporting that idea there's a negative correlation between the two. After that, it explains why inequality might go against economic growth. It could be due to poor human capital accumulation and low fertility rates. It could also be because it creates political instability, resulting in lower investment. It could also be because it affects social consensus or social cohesion. So, all of these are destabilizing factors which might affect the economy. After that, it says one important research topic is correlation between democratization and income redistribution. Now, what is democratization? It is defining democratization as extending suffrage or voting rights to a wider class of people. When this happens, then the low and the middle income voters gain in political power. If they gain in political power, they might be able to influence circumstances so that some income from the wealthy is redistributed to those who do not have that much income. That's what this part is. Broader support for income redistribution and social welfare expansion. But if the rich have more political influence than the poor, then the democratic system actually worsens income inequality. So, the link between democracy and income redistribution is a little unclear. Sometimes it could help, sometimes it could worsen things. So, in this paragraph, the main point that we're trying to make is that most studies have found that income inequality hampers economic growth due to several factors. It reduces human capital formation, increases political instability, and it also influences income distribution dynamics in democracies. Of course, we can go into a lot more detail, but we're just trying to sum up this paragraph, so I think this is enough. So that's it, we are done with the passage. Let's do a very quick recap. In the first paragraph, we talked about arguments for income inequality promoting economic growth. In the second paragraph, we said that most studies find that income inequality hampers economic growth. And that's it. So, our main idea is going to be that while there are some arguments that claim income inequality can promote economic growth, most research finds that the opposite is true. So, as I said, the best thing about this passage was that it is only 2 paragraphs and we're done with those 2 paragraphs. The question says, according to the incentive or moral hazard argument, which one of the designs below is most consistent with the claim that some inequality can raise growth? So, first of all, we need to understand the incentive or moral hazard argument. For this, please take a look at the text. The second argument is related to moral hazard and incentives, and then it explains what it is. Economic performance is determined by the unobservable level of effort that agents make. What this means is, we cannot observe the effort that people are putting into their economic performance. Paying compensations without taking into account the economic performance achieved will fail to elicit optimum effort from the agents. So, what does this mean? This means we should pay people according to output. People on the basis of output. Now, there are times I wish my handwriting was slightly better, but this is all we have. And why should we do that? Because effort is unobservable. I'm just translating what I think this is saying. Thus, certain income inequalities contribute to growth by enhancing worker motivation. If you are paid on the basis of output, you will obviously make more effort to produce greater output. That is how it will enhance worker motivation. So, that's the argument. Now, let's keep this in mind. Our first option says a regime that concentrates stock ownership in relation to corporate governance. This does not relate to the incentive argument. This is a completely different argument. It is the third argument mentioned in the first paragraph. So, I would reject this straight away. The second one says rents protected by market power that enlarge top incomes without linking pay to results. This is the opposite of the incentive argument, because here income is not linked to output, whereas in this case we are trying to say that people should be compensated on the basis of their output rather than effort. So, option 2 is not consistent with the claim. The third one says wages are determined by tenure rather than output to ensure equity. So, the senior most people will get paid the most money and junior employees will not get paid that much. In this case, are you being compensated according to output? No, you are being compensated according to seniority. So, this is also not in line with the incentive claim. So, let's eliminate 3. The fourth one says pay rewards on verifiable performance for highly productive workers. Finally, we are linking something to performance or output, and that is why option 4 is the correct choice. The passage refers to democratization. Choose the one option below that comes closest to the opposite of this process. So, whenever I see a question like this, I always first try to understand how democratization is defined in the passage. So, I will show you what I started off with. Look at the highlighted part. Democratization extends suffrage or voting rights to a wider class of people. Now, if I want to pick something that is the opposite of this process, then obviously I'm going to talk about shrinking voting rights, perhaps. Now, for this, I would say you should look at all the options together, because you can only decide relatively. And the first option, it talks about totalitarianism. But in this case, they're not actually doing anything that is totalitarian. They adopted participatory budgeting and recall elections. In this case, you're actually giving people a lot more power. So, I didn't understand how this would be totalitarian. This seems to be further democratization. In any case, it doesn't really talk about shrinking voting rights. So, option 1 is eliminated. The second one, the coalition imposed term limits and strengthened judicial review in order to further entrench autocratic rule. So here also autocracy is kind of the opposite of democracy, but we are not talking about shrinking suffrage or reducing suffrage or voting rights. So I would reject option 2. The third one, in fact, is the only one that talks about authoritarianism as linked to narrowed suffrage. So since I already had an idea that democratization means extending suffrage, shrinking suffrage is obviously going to be the opposite of the process. Since option 3 is the only one that talks about shrinking voting rights, I would think that option 3 probably is the correct choice. So we keep 3. The fourth one, corporate donations were capped and parties received public funding, which was portrayed as establishing an oligarchy. Oligarchies are governance by the rich. But here, we are still not talking about narrowing voting rights. So even though oligarchy may be very, very different from a democracy, this is not the opposite of the process. So let's eliminate option 4. So we go back, our answer is option 3, and I hope you understood why. Because here we are extending suffrage, here we are narrowing suffrage. So it is the direct opposite of democratization as described in the passage. This question I thought would be very simple. Which one of the options below best summarizes the passage? So for this, we can take a look at the recap. In the first paragraph, we talked about how income inequality can promote growth. In the second paragraph, we were trying to say that in fact, studies show the opposite. So I'm going to try and account for both of these facets. Our first option says that the passage confines its discussion to financing gaps and corporate control. Now, by the time that I reached here, overlooking the significance of concerns regarding human capital accumulation, fertility rates and redistribution, that's not true. Because in the second half, we are taking into account all of these factors. So I cannot say that it overlooks the significance of these concerns. So let's eliminate the first option. The second one says the passage claims that evaluating the effect of income inequality on economic growth without considering both short and long-term consequences is misguided. So the passage does do both of those evaluations. It looks at arguments that say income inequality can promote growth. It also looks at studies that say the opposite. But nowhere does it say that this particular type of evaluation is misguided. So because of this word, I thought option 2 is not the right choice. The third one, the passage outlines investment, incentive and governance channels through which income inequality may support economic growth. This is my first para. Reports short-term gains while noting long-term drawbacks. Now this seems to be on point because that's exactly what the second paragraph is saying. Long-term drawbacks. So in the second paragraph, we've said that income inequality does not really help economic growth, it hampers it. So I would keep 3. The fourth option says that income inequality accelerates economic growth while also emphasizing the significance of concerns regarding human capital accumulation, fertility rates and political instability. Now, if I compare 3 and 4, the fourth one does not actively tell me that income inequality does not lead to economic growth. So I would eliminate option 4 and say option 3 is the right choice. The question here is the primary function of the 3-part case for a positive income inequality economic growth link in the first half of the passage is to show that. Honestly, I didn't quite understand the question, but I do know that I will have to refer to the 3 arguments presented in the first paragraph. So that is what we are going to be looking at. Alright, so I have taken some relevant parts of the text just to illustrate how we would probably eliminate options. Our first option says inequality can aid short-term growth in settings with high sunk costs, incentive alignment and concentrated ownership. So, high sunk costs, this is the first argument. Whenever there's a huge investment required, we need people with large amounts of money to invest. So that is the first argument. Incentive alignment is the second argument. Concentrated ownership is the third argument. So option 1 seems to deal with all 3 arguments. I'm very happy with that. Let's keep it. The second one says mature stock markets make wealth concentration unnecessary, yet they might still be harmful to investment. First of all, In the first paragraph, we are not talking about how wealth concentration is unnecessary. We are in fact saying that wealth concentration might be essential to economic growth, and we are presenting arguments in favor of wealth concentration. For example, look at the first part. The first argument focuses on investment indivisibilities, where large sunk costs are required when implementing new fundamental innovations. In this case, we do need people to have a lot of money to make large investments, for which wealth will be concentrated, and that will be helpful. So option 2 is out. The third one says dispersed market ownership or dispersed ownership speeds corporate decision making. Now look at this part. If stock ownership is distributed and owned by a large number of shareholders, it is not easy to make quick decisions. So, it definitely does not speed corporate decision making. I can eliminate 3 right away. The fourth one, inequality boosts growth in every period and type of economy. For this, look at this part here. Income inequality has a positive impact on economic growth in the short run, but the two are negatively correlated in the long run. So, I cannot say that it boosts growth in every period and type of economy. This is a bit too extreme. I mean, even if I didn't check the text, I would probably say this is not the right choice. So, our answer is option 1. Here we have a paragraph completion question, and I think this is one that can be solved. Now, we have a given sentence. We have to figure out where this sentence will fit. The reason that you see only the sentence on the screen is that we're going to do the before and after technique. What that means is we read the sentence and we try to predict the kind of text that should come before it and the kind of text that should come after it. The sentence says, everything is old world, traditional techniques from Mexico, Eva emphasizes. So obviously this is a person speaking. So before this, I might expect an introduction of Eva and what she does, because she's talking about everything being old world and traditional techniques. So she must be talking about something that she does or is involved in. After this, we might expect a description of what these traditional techniques are. So this would be my guess. Now, let's take a look at the paragraph. The first sentence says, the sisters embrace the ways that their great-grandfather built and repaired instruments. So it doesn't really name the sisters, but I'm assuming Eva is one of the sisters. So could it be blank 1? In a way, yes, it could be blank 1, because they have embraced the way that their great-grandfather built and repaired instruments. That is in line with old world traditional techniques. Now, after this also, if we read, when crafting a Mexican guitarron used in mariachi music, they use tacote wood for the top of the instrument. So again, we are talking about traditional techniques. You'll have to forgive my pronunciation of these words because I didn't do my research there, but barring that, I am very, very sure of the logic. We are definitely on for option 1. So we keep that. Now, let's take a look at the second blank. Just before the second blank, we have already talked about the techniques that the sisters or the family uses. After we have gone into the details of these techniques, it's a little weird to put in the generic sentence that everything is old world traditional techniques from Mexico. It is after this sentence that we should be providing the details, not before. So, it cannot be the second option, because at this point, the given sentence will be redundant. Now, let's go to the third blank. Just before blank 3, we've said that the store has a 3-year wait list, and after that it says that the family's artisanship has attracted stars like Los Lobos. So this talks about the reputation that the family has built up over generations. Clearly, we have moved on to a different aspect of the whole enterprise. So I cannot put in the given sentence here because the given sentence talks about the techniques. So option 3 is out of the picture. Now look at the fourth blank. Before the fourth blank, we have talked about how guitars have been made by all 3 generations of the Delgado family. After that also, we are still talking about how the sisters have been involved in the family business from an early age. So in this part of the text, we have started discussing how multiple generations of the family have worked in the business, slightly different subtopic. We're not really talking about the traditional techniques per se. So the given sentence is not going to fit here, which means that the answer has to be the first option. Now, if I want to mark option 1, I will actually have to select the third option here, option 3, which is equal to blank 1. This passage is about music. That might be scary for some people, but at the same time, I found that it's not as difficult as I would expect a passage on music to be. It's not abstract for sure. The first part says that when you are faced with electronic music, then you might ask yourself two questions. Number one, is this type of artistic creation music at all? So that's one. The second one, given that the product is accepted as music of a new type or order, is not such music inhuman? So first of all, is this music? Second, if it is music, is it human music? So these are the two questions that would arise. Of course, there is a lot of detail after that, but I would then start looking at this part. So we're saying that a lot of times in the past, we thought of music as direct, open, emotional expression and as a subjective form of communication. See, if that is the case, then music will have to be created by a human in its entirety. But then we said that in recent times, we do not think of music as subjective emotional expression anymore. We have a more objective definition of music. So for that, I'm going to read here. But since the third decade of our century, many composers have preferred more objective definitions of music, epitomized in Stravinsky's description of it as a form of speculation in terms of sound and time. So music is no longer thought of as subjective emotional expression of the composer. It is now more objective in form. And if you look at music with this newfound perspective, then you are likely to be more accepting of electronic music. That is what the last part says. An acceptance of this more characteristic 20th century view of the art of musical composition will immediately bring the layman closer to an understanding of and sympathetic response to electronic music. You might appreciate it a little bit more and consider it actual music. So the topic here obviously is electronic music, and we are trying to say that we may appreciate electronic music if we adopt the modern 20th view of music as an objective structural art instead of the older idea of music as an emotional, subjective emotional expression. Now paragraph 2 says that okay, we have started to appreciate electronic music because we now have a newfound appreciation for it. But there is still a communication problem. What is the communication problem? This medium employs a new language of forms. So it uses a new musical language basically. And because it uses a new language, we may not be able to understand it. After that it says, when the new structural procedures of electronic music are at last fully understood by the listener, the barriers between him and the work he faces will be removed. When you understand the language, you will understand the music. So that's all that this paragraph is saying. The argument is that electronic music is hard to understand because it uses a new musical language. But once you grasp the new structures, then there is no communication problem. Now in this paragraph, we are trying to say that people can use electronic music to reproduce traditional forms of music, but a serious composer is not going to do that. It says that a serious composer feels that it is in the exploration of sui generis languages. Now, of course, we do not quite understand this, but that's okay. Sui generis means unique or of its own kind. So, they want to explore new languages and forms that the aesthetic magic of the new medium lies. So, they would use electronic music to create new forms of music instead of reproducing traditional forms. That is what the paragraph is trying to say. And that's basically the argument, that serious composers see electronic music not as a tool for imitating traditional forms, but as a medium for creating entirely new musical languages and forms. Now, here we are talking about the second objection. Remember, in the very first paragraph, we had raised two questions. The second question was about the music being inhuman. So, when we talk about electronic music, we think that the music is not human music. But the author here reminds us that it is the composer who fires the machines, collects the sounds, manipulates them, pushes the buttons. So ultimately, there is a human agent that creates that music. So all that we are trying to say in this paragraph is that electronic music is seen as inhuman, but every aspect of it is created, shaped and controlled by a human agent. So it is not inhuman music. That's basically the author's point. Now let's do a recap. In the first paragraph, we talked about how appreciation of electronic music will require us to adopt a modern 20th century view of music as an objective art, rather than looking at music as emotional human expression. Then we said that electronic music is hard to understand because it uses a new musical language, and this might create a barrier between the listener and the music that they're listening to. But once we are able to understand the new structures, then all these barriers will disappear. Then we talked about how serious composers use electronic music to create new musical languages and forms. And finally, we said that some people believe electronic music to be inhuman, but actually it is not, because all aspects of that music require a human agent. So in the end, this passage is simply trying to say that electronic music is a legitimate human-driven art form, that we should not frown on it or look down upon it, and misunderstandings arise only because we are unfamiliar with its structures and forms. So overall, the author is trying to recommend electronic music to us. This question is asking us, what relation does the communication problem mentioned in paragraph 2 have to the questions that the author recounts at the beginning of the passage? So let me show you the questions at the beginning of the passage. Question number 1, is this type of artistic creation music at all? So is electronic music music at all? And secondly, if we accept that it is music, isn't it inhuman? These are the questions that were raised. In paragraph 2, we talked about how a communication problem will remain. And what is this problem arising out of? Because it uses new musical structures. So once we understand these new musical forms, then we will be able to understand electronic music. So as far as I can see, we are kind of trying to address those questions by saying, yes, electronic music is probably a type of music. Our first option says, unfamiliar forms and terms might get in the way of our seeing electronic music as music, but this can be overcome. That's exactly what the author is saying over here. When the new structural procedures of electronic music are at last fully understood, the barriers between the listener and the work he faces will be removed. So yes, this can be overcome. Ultimately, option 1 is in accordance with the passage, we keep it. The second one says, its unfamiliar language of forms and novel terms mean that we cannot see electronic music as music. But the author is trying to say that we should be able to see it. In fact, we are addressing the first question here, and the author is trying to say that, sometimes there might be a gap in understanding, but once you're able to understand the new musical language, then you will be able to see it as music. So we can't say that because it does not employ traditional musical concepts, we will not be able to see it. In fact, once the barriers are removed, we will recognize it as a legitimate art form. So option 2 is not supported. The third one, the communication problem is what allows us to see electronic music as music. Well, what we are really trying to say in paragraph 2 is that once the communication problem is removed, then we will be able to see electronic music as music. So option 3 seems to muddle the waters a little bit. Also, music must be difficult to understand is not stated anywhere in the passage. All that the author is trying to really tell us is that, look, it's new and unfamiliar, but once you get it, you'll get it. But it does not really tell us that music must be difficult to understand. So because of this part also, I think it's very easy to eliminate the third option. Now the fourth option says none. None means there is no relation between the questions and the communication problem mentioned in para 2. But I would say that's a little unlikely, because whenever I have two paragraphs side by side, then most likely they are related. That's just common sense. Secondly, if you really understand what paragraph 2 is saying, it is trying to address the first question, is this type of artistic creation music at all? And we are trying to say that, look, you may not see it as music initially because you don't understand it, but once you do understand it, you will see it as music. So we can't say that they're unrelated to one another and form different parts of the discussion. So they're not different topics altogether. Let's eliminate 4. So our answer is going to be the first option. Even if you were not able to eliminate the others with a lot of confidence, I think the first option should still have given you a lot of confidence because it is absolutely in line with paragraph 2. So option 1 is the right choice. The question is very short, thankfully. The goal of the author over the course of this passage is 2. For this, we should take a look at the passage recap. Now, overall, the author seems to be saying to us that electronic music is music. Please appreciate it. Okay, that's kind of what I understood. So let's keep that in mind. The first one says, differentiate between electronic music and other forms of music. Well, the author has not really highlighted the differences. No such comparison was there. We are just trying to talk about electronic music by itself. So let's eliminate one. The second one says, defend electronic music from certain common charges. So in the very first paragraph, we are trying to say that when you encounter electronic music, you start questioning, is it music at all? And if it is music, is it human music? So these are some of the charges that the author is trying to defend electronic music from. The author is trying to say, yes, it is music and it is also human music. So I would say option 2 seems to be on point. The third one says, differentiate the modern composer from the 19th century composer. We have talked about two different views of music, but the passage as a whole is not trying to figure out the difference between the 19th century composer and the modern composer. That might be a very, very small part of the passage, if at all. So let's eliminate 3. The fourth one says, defend the serious-minded composer from Lejaron Hill and Stravinsky. Again, we have talked about serious composers, but the focus is not on differentiating the serious ones from others. Even if the author did do that, it's a very small part of the passage. It does not really tell us the goal of the passage. So regardless of how you look at it, option 4 is not the right choice, which means that our answer is option 2. If you understand the passage, I think this is a fairly easy question. The mention of Stravinsky's description of music in the first paragraph does all of the following except. Now, I found some options tricky here, but we will first start off with Stravinsky's description. What we are trying to say is that Stravinsky came up with a more modern understanding of music. And it says that if you accept this more characteristic 20th century view of art of music, then you might be able to appreciate electronic music. So as far as I can see, the purpose of mentioning Stravinsky is to say that this modern description of music is slightly more relevant to electronic music. And if you take this view forward, then you will be able to appreciate it. So that's what I'm going to go with. Now, option 1 says, help us determine which sounds are musical and which are not. I want you to look at this part. If we hold on to Stravinsky's description of music, then we might be sympathetic to electronic music even if the forms, sounds and approaches are foreign to us. That basically means that even when something does not quite sound like music to us, we might still be able to appreciate it. So if you interpret this in the fashion that I did, then you will realize that the author is not actually trying to tell us that we will be able to determine which sounds are musical and which are not. In fact, there are certain sounds that might not sound musical to us, but we may still be able to develop an appreciation for it. So option 1 could be an exception. Let's keep it. The second one, complicate our notion of what is communicated through music. So I was confused between options 1 and 2 because I'm not sure if Stravinsky's description is complicating our notion of what is communicated through music. But at the same time, what we have to understand is that Stravinsky is widening our understanding of what music comprises. So in a way, yes, he's broadening our horizons. So complicating our notion could be equal to widening our definition of music. So that way, option 2 is not an exception. The third option says, respond to and expand upon earlier understandings of music. This obviously is true because we are trying to say that even if something seems new and unfamiliar, you may still be able to appreciate it. So this is not an exception. And the fourth one, allow us to classify electronic music as music. And here we are definitely saying that sympathetic response to electronic music. So option 4 is not an exception, which means that we go back to the first option. Yes, I was confused between 1 and 2, but then if you understand the last part, then you will still be able to say that option 1 is the exception. For a change, in this year's paper, there were a few questions related to vocabulary, and this of course is related to a particular phrase. Now, I thought that if you read and understood the sentence surrounding this phrase, it might be possible to get to the answer, but that may not necessarily be true of everyone. So the question is, from the context in which it is placed, the phrase sui generis in paragraph 3 suggests which one of the following. So let's take a look at paragraph 3. Again, comprehension is key. What we're trying to say is that while a composer can try to reproduce traditional forms of music, he feels that it is in the exploration of sui generis languages and forms that the magic of the new medium lies. What we are trying to say here is that a serious composer is looking at new forms of music. So this is how I would interpret this. Sui generis probably means new, different, or unique. Now, of course, if you're familiar with this expression, then life is very simple. So I'm going to assume that you're not familiar with the expression because I honestly was not. But this is how I guessed the answer. So now let's take a look at the options. The first option is particular. See, particular could mean unique. Will this word fit? It is in the exploration of particular or unique languages and forms that the aesthetic magic of the new medium lies. So could work. The second one says generic. Now, this is obviously a derivation from generis, so some of us might pick this if we are blindly guessing. But generic means that the composer is trying to produce very, very general music. Here we are trying to say that they are going to use the new medium to produce some sort of special music. So definitely not option 2. Option 3 says unaesthetic, which obviously is not going to work because here we are talking about the aesthetic magic of the new medium. Unaesthetic means unappealing, aesthetic means appealing or pleasant. So obviously not 3. The fourth one says indescribable. Now this is a word we could have picked. Because we are talking about electronic music, we might start thinking, okay, so it's very difficult to describe in human words. But that is becoming too philosophical. All that we really need to do is to read the sentence and try to come up with a word that we would have used in place of the phrase sui generis. We are not talking about indescribable languages, we are just talking about new or different languages. So option 4 is not our answer. The correct choice is particular. My advice would be that in such questions, you should not guess blindly. If you're fairly certain about the logic of the sentence, then you can take a shot at it. But if you don't understand the sentence or you're not able to substitute your own words for the phrase there, then you should not have attempted it.